We've now reached the end of John's Gospel, chapter 20. We're looking at the final section where Jesus now appears to Thomas. And I'm reading to you from John 20, verse 24 to verse 31. Now Thomas, called Didymus, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. When the other disciples told him that they had seen the Lord, he declared, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my finger where the nails were, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe it." A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. And though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." And then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas answered, "My Lord and my God." And then Jesus told him, "Because you've seen me, you have believed. Well, blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." And Jesus did many other miraculous signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Now, Thomas is an important character for us. He's important in many ways. In fact, some of the most important characters, I would say, like Thomas, are the characters who are, on the surface, failures. Thomas is known throughout history as Doubting Thomas. And he's known as Doubting Thomas simply because of this passage here in John's Gospel. You see it from here. Thomas, called Didymus, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. That was the first day of the week. Don't know why he didn't come. Wasn't there, was not explained. It's neither here nor there. Had other business, maybe, something even more pressing. But when the other disciples told him that they had seen the Lord, he declared, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my finger where the nails were, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe it." Now here, Thomas is the first empiricist. He is the first experimental scientist. I do not believe things on the testimony of other people. I believe it by checking it for myself. Now, he's been called Doubting Thomas because of that, because he doubted the testimony of the other disciples. He did not believe it. Why did he not believe it? Well, I think it's a fairly interesting question to ask that. On the surface of it, it's impossible to believe that someone has come back from the dead and people have seen them. It's therefore not surprising that Thomas, a very outspoken and blunt disciple, would say that it's against all reason, it's against all my experience, it's against all of history, it's against everything that I know and understand, so I cannot easily believe what you say. You must have been mistaken, it must have been someone else, it must have been something that happened. I don't go along with this story. Now, it's important for us to understand the role that Thomas plays here, because in many ways he plays the role of the person who, like us, stands many centuries apart from this story and asks ourselves the questions, are the disciples making this up? Have they got some ulterior motive to go around telling the world that Jesus Christ came back from the dead? Were they all in this together? Well, Thomas gives us a tool or a mechanism for seeing that it's reasonable at this point here to doubt unless you see for yourself. And it's unfair, I think, in many ways that Thomas got labelled Doubting Thomas, because I think many of the other disciples may well have had the same situation if they had not seen Jesus for themselves. But they did, a week earlier. And Thomas remains in that position of doubting because it goes against all of his experience. But there's a curious thing here, and one which is hard to explain, because it did not go against all of Thomas's experience. 2 weeks before, 1 week before Jesus Christ was crucified and dead, the disciples went to Bethany at the request of Mary and Martha, whose brother Lazarus had died. They had seen Jesus raise Lazarus from the dead. They'd seen him call forth the death of Lazarus, the body of Lazarus, from the tomb, and they had seen him become resurrected again. Thomas will have seen that. And Thomas, you would have thought, would have felt to himself, gosh, that is, if Jesus can do that for this person who was dead, could he not do it for himself? One might even expect that he would. So the question might be, why? Why did Thomas find it so difficult to believe that Jesus was raised from the dead when he had seen that very act take place a couple of weeks ago? Well, it could be that Thomas was ultra-skeptical. It could be that, and we're speculating here wildly, that maybe Thomas wasn't even convinced of the resurrection of Lazarus. Maybe he thought he'd just been put into the tomb too early, that he'd regained consciousness after the cool of the tomb, and that Jesus had brought him forth, and maybe he didn't believe in that resurrection. We don't know. All we do know is that Thomas doubted quite strongly the idea that anyone could be raised from the dead. And that doubt is something which is shared hugely by people all down the ages and by people today. We all of us stand in the position of doubting Thomas, insofar as, particularly if we are empiricists or scientists in our approach, we want to see the evidence for our own eyes. But that's the one thing that we cannot do. And this is why Thomas is a good proxy for us. Because one person who does share those doubts, one person who may echo the doubts of people today, was the person who questioned that very event of the resurrection of Christ and who doubted it at that time, and stands in for those people today who may doubt it still. He is the proxy scientist. He is the proxy empiricist who checked things out for himself and was not convinced simply on the word or testimony of others. Here is someone who required solid physical evidence. And the value that Thomas provides for us today is that because he demanded that solid physical evidence, we have a record of it here. A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. And again, though the doors were locked, again for fear of the Jews, we have the same kind of impossible event that takes place. Though the doors were locked, that word though stands in contrast to the fact that Jesus appeared. That Jesus appeared despite the fact the doors were locked. So he wasn't in there ready and then they locked the doors after. No. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Again, there's the startling alarm, the fear, the anxiety, the worry of this supernatural event taking place, it would leave people, anyone in a group, fearful, where you're confronted with supernatural raw power, a power that can bring the dead back to life. Anxiety is calmed again. He says, peace be with you. Be peaceful. Do not be anxious. Do not worry. And then he said to Thomas, put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe. The very things that Thomas set as a test for truth, that unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hands into his side, I will not believe it. What Thomas means by that is, yes, somebody may have appeared. I don't know who it was. I don't believe it was Jesus Christ. Yes, I do believe that you saw somebody. Yes, I don't know who it was. I don't know who is pretending that, but one thing for certain is the only way to make sure that it was Jesus is I want to see the nail marks in his hands. I want to see the cut in his side. Then I'll believe it was actually him and not somebody else. Could it have been a substitute? Could there have been someone masquerading as Jesus, pretending to be Jesus? No. No, why? Because of Thomas. And because of this empirical evidence presented to him. Jesus seems to have known exactly what it was that Thomas wanted or required as the test to be convinced. And he meets that test perfectly. Reach out your finger here in his hands. Reach out your side and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe. We're not told whether Thomas actually went so far as to put his finger into the side of Jesus, but he saw the marks. And whatever he saw, whatever he was confronted with, that was evidence enough for him. The doubting skeptic, the one who could not be convinced except by solid physical evidence, was convinced that it was true. And that conviction converted his mind in a moment, and he understood the implications. Thomas answered, "My Lord and my God." The conflating of those two things together is not strange. My Lord, my teacher, the one I followed for 3 years, the one I looked to as the one who is in charge of my life, is the same person who is my God. Thomas gets it. Thomas gets the message which Jesus has been given all this time from an earlier conversation. Just show us the Father and we will believe. And Jesus said, "Do you not know me, Philip? Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father." Jesus unambiguously claimed Godhood, that the very words which he spoke were the very words of God. And here Thomas acknowledges that absolutely and completely. One can imagine him falling down at the feet of Jesus and worshipping him. It doesn't say that, but I can imagine that may be similar. There's a mild rebuke here to Thomas from the words of Jesus. Because you have seen me, you have believed. In other words, the test of empirical evidence, you've seen the evidence of your own eyes, and no wonder you believe. But there is a test of faith for those people who are not able to see for their own eyes, people who 2,000 years later will read these accounts, and they will ask themselves whether it is true or not. And here Thomas provides the best proxy for doing that test ourselves. Here is someone who stands in our place if we doubt the resurrection and asks the same questions that we would ask, and is fully satisfied by that. Blessed are those then who have not seen and yet have believed. The idea is then that if you have seen it, the resurrection of Christ, and believed, you're blessed because you believe, but more blessed are those who have greater faith in me and greater trust in me, and didn't even require to see the physical marks of my crucifixion to know that it was indeed me. If you believe that, then you are even more blessed, even more benefited. Jesus did many other miraculous signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. We can only speculate about those. Well, we don't need to speculate about them. There are some which are mentioned in the final chapter, which we're coming up to next time. But the point is that John is giving excerpts and selections from what he can. And coming to the end of this book, he's written quite a lot. But these are written, he says, we have sufficient information here. These are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Many things were done, many miracles shown. There is no point in multiplying them, because even just one miracle would be sufficient. One idea, which is the resurrection, is more than enough to be convinced of the truth of what I'm saying here. These are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. In other words, Jesus is the Messiah. Jesus is the one who was predicted and spoken of throughout the Old Testament, and therefore seals the Old Testament by his coming, and completes the prophecies of the Old Testament in him and in his life. He is the Son of God, which means his very words are the words of God, and therefore we treat him as though he were God himself. And that by believing in that, believing that he is the fulfillment of the Old Testament, and that he is the Son of God himself, and looking and trusting to him in such a way that it changes our own lives, so that we conform our lives to his teaching, then by believing you may have life in his name. And therefore you will have a full life, a life which is run on the principles of the divine Son of God, who teaches us how best to live and how to approach and to meet back with God through the forgiveness of sins. This is the gospel which is now being proclaimed. In some ways, John's gospel seems to naturally come to an end at this point, and it would almost be an ending, except that for some reason there is more to be said. It would be a natural end for the book, but here there are some loose ends which we need to tie up, and we'll see that particularly when we look at the miraculous catch of fish, and especially when Jesus reinstates Peter at the end of John's Gospel.